Good day to you lovely people, it's David Anthony, the Creepy Bard, coming to you from Cahokia National Historic Site here in Illinois, right on the eastern side of the Mississippi River, just over the river from St. Louis, Missouri. And first of all, it is a beautiful morning, the sun is shining, it's just rising over the horizon right behind me, isn't that lovely? And over here we've got all this mist over the grass, it's all nice and pretty, but of course the big thing that I want to show you is these mounds, and I'm going to get a little bit closer to show you what these are. These are mounds, much like the mound that I showed you out in West Virginia, Grave Creek Mound.
Actually, I did not show you Grave Creek Mound in West Virginia. I wanted to, I really did, but, well, take a look.
Well, I am on the other side of the West Virginia Panhandle in Moundsville, West Virginia, and I don't know how well you can see it, but behind me is the Grave Creek Mound. Now,
So yeah, apparently I was able to see this mound in the dark, but the camera wasn't. That being said, I still want to show you a few pictures of it so you have a point of comparison for the mounds that I'm about to show you, because this mound is about 1,000 years older than the Cahokia Mounds and was built by the Adena culture, which flourished from about the 11th century BC till about the 3rd century BC. This mound was built around the tail end of that period, so to give you a frame of reference, that was around the same time that the Romans were fighting the Carthaginians and the Punic Wars, and around the same time Qin Shi Huangdi was unifying all of China into what would become China. Now, unlike the mounds in Cahokia, the Adena mounds were burial mounds, and these things would be built over the course of generations, with one generation building a tomb, putting a body in it, covering it up with dirt, and the next generation repeating the process on top of the old tomb, adding layer upon layer upon layer until you've got this big whopping mound. And there would have been a mound like this at the center of every Adena city, and there were dozens of these cities up and down the Ohio River Valley, and these were advanced cities with sedentary agriculture, social stratification, and complex trade networks reaching all the way down the Mississippi River, all the way to the Gulf of Mexico, and even further to the east coast of North America. The only big advancement that they didn't have was writing, which is a shame, because then we wouldn't have to call them the Adena culture. We'd actually know what they called themselves.
but the other thing is that these mounds are about 1,000 years younger than the one in West Virginia. You see, the one in West Virginia, that was built by the Adena civilization, which thrived from, about the 11th century BC to about the 3rd century BC or so, living up and down the Ohio River Valley, building cities, farming squash, making pottery and jewelry, and trading up and down the river with each other. And they had a social hierarchy, with people at the bottom, the common people, who they got cremated when they died, and then the people at the top, they got put into burial chambers in the mounds, like that big mound that I showed you in West Virginia. And really, really, really big mounds, those didn't really get built until the end of the Adena period, around the 3rd century BC or so. And there's a lot of scholars who argue as to whether that's the height of the Adena period or the beginning of the Hopewell civilization, which is what followed the Adena civilization. The Hopewell civilization, much like the Adena civilization, except that it spread not just the Ohio River Valley, but also the Mississippi River Valley, and also the Missouri River Valley. Also, they didn't just make burial mounds, they made other mounds as well. Mounds with nothing in them except dirt. And we're not really sure why they built those mounds, because here's the thing, they didn't leave any sort of written record. So we have no idea why they built what they built. By the way, there's the mound behind me. A little bit more close up. We also don't know what they actually called themselves, because the thing is that we call them the Adena civilization, the Hopewell civilization, but those are names that we made up because we don't know what they called themselves, because they didn't leave any sort of written records. We also don't know why the Hopewell civilization just sort of collapsed. Which is what happened around the 6th century AD, was when the Hopewell civilization just sort of collapsed. A lot of the cities just suddenly became abandoned. Nobody was just living there anymore. And for those cities that were still around, suddenly they didn't build mounds anymore. They stopped building mounds. Instead, they spent all of their time building fortifications and walls around their cities. And so what exactly was going on? Well, a lot of scholars have noticed that it was around that time when the bow and arrow got invented. So maybe that had something to do with it. It's a new weapon that was out there, and it upset the social order. There's also a lot of scholars who mention that there was a climate change event going around at that time, and that might also have something to do with it. But either way, the point is that around the 6th century, there was an apocalypse event in the Mississippi River Valley, and the Hopewell civilization just kind of fell apart. And things kind of stayed that way for a few hundred years until the 9th century, when the Mississippian culture, again, we don't know that they called themselves that, they didn't leave us any writings, that's the name that we gave them. The Mississippian culture came along, and they were the ones who built these mounds that are behind me, which I'm going to show you a little bit closer, that really big one, in just a moment. Let's see if I can get a little bit closer to that. So it was a Mississippian culture that built mounds such as this one right here. This is today known as Monk's Mount, and that thing is freaking huge. Just imagine the amount of manpower and time and hours and labor that went into building this thing. Now you'll notice with this mound, as opposed to the one in West Virginia, the one in West Virginia had a round top. This has a flat top, leaving a lot of scholars to believe that there was probably a temple built on top of it. In addition to that, you have evidence of post holes and evidence of other structures. So this was not a burial mound, rather this was meant to be a temple. I'm going to go ahead and head up to the top of it and get a view from the top of there. And while I'm on my way up there, I will tell you a little bit about the rise and fall of the Mississippian culture. So Mississippian culture started in the 9th century when some bright guy came along with the idea, hey, let's start growing corn and beans instead of just squash. And wouldn't you know it, having a stable food source is the sort of thing that ends up giving you, more leisure time and more security to be able to spend time to build huge mounds like that and huge temples. And the Mississippian culture thrived from about the 9th century until, about the 16th century when, Europeans came along. Now, keep in mind, the Europeans didn't actually kill off the Mississippian culture. They didn't have to, not intentionally anyway. They did so with disease. You had people like Ponce de Leon exploring Florida, and people like De Soto exploring what is now the American South. And when these people came exploring, they brought all sorts of diseases with them. We're talking smallpox, we're talking cholera, we're talking, things like influenza. Now, something like influenza just sounds something like, so it's just simple, but if you've never had it before, it's not as simple as you might think, because the natives didn't have any natural immunities to any of these diseases. And of course, the Europeans, when they came, they had no idea they were bringing diseases. Germ theory didn't exist yet. They didn't know what was going on, and the natives certainly didn't know what's going on. So imagine that you're living in a place like this, which this is a metropolis. This is a city, a huge city of about, 10,000 to 20,000 people or so. Some guy comes from downriver and he's looking horrible and he's looking sick and he's telling you horrible stories about what's been going on downriver. And next thing you know, 5 or 10 people in town are sick. Next thing you know, a couple of 100 people in town are sick. And within a few days, everyone in town is sick, and I mean everyone, all 20,000 people. And here's the thing, when everyone is sick, there's no one to care for those who are sick. So you might have something as simple as influenza, and the only thing that's standing between you and death is a drink of water. But if there's nobody there to give you that drink of water, then you're gonna die. And the problem with an apocalypse event like that is that when everybody starts dying, when the vast majority of people die, when the shamans die, when the elders die, when the chiefs die, and you've got a society that has no written language and everything is oral, well then that's it. Then their history is gone, their mythology is gone, and the survivors that are left, they only have just vague memories of what little they happen to know. And who knows if a shaman who actually knows all of the legends and the myths actually managed to survive. And now that I've arrived at Monk's Mount, I see my old nemesis. Stairs. I'm gonna finish this when I get to the top. I am now halfway up Monk's Mount, and I would like to show you, here we have the first terrace right here. Those are the stairs behind me that I just came up, and those are the stairs that I have yet to go up to the higher terrace above that. But you see, this first terrace is just a flat area. They've done excavations here. They have found evidence that there were buildings up here, that this was probably a ritual area. This was some sort of temple complex. Now, when the French got here, by the time the French got here, this is already grown over. Because remember, they had an apocalypse. Everyone died from the bloody plague. There was nobody left. The survivors, this is by the time the French came along into this area, the survivors that were left didn't even remember what had once been here. So they really couldn't tell much to the French when they came. And the French actually built a little settlement up here on this initial terrace, just a little fort. And stairs. I'll see you at the top. So yeah, by the time the French and the English settlers arrived here, what had been here was long forgotten. Nobody knew what it was, even the survivors. It was an apocalypse. The survivors didn't remember anything because they'd lost all of their history. But 500 years ago, before the Europeans came, this was a huge metropolis. Right now I am on top of the upper terrace of what would have been some sort of temple complex. And you can see behind me there would have been the city. You see there's a little mound right there. That would have been either another temple or possibly a palace. They're not 100% sure because, again, no writings. But there would have been a huge city, sprawling, all sorts of buildings. Every little mound, every little hillock that you see out there, that was all built by the Mississippians. And on top of each one was something, possibly a temple, possibly a palace. Over there you can see another one out in the distance there. And over on the horizon is St. Louis. There's the Mississippi River separating us and St. Louis. There's the Arch, St. Louis Arch, the gateway to the west. And I will be going in that direction, continuing west, ever, ever westward.